All right, we are now live. Okay, my name is Ashlen Hilliard, and I am the assistant to the executive director for the International Cultic Studies Association. I am here with Gillie Jenkinson, who has graciously agreed to spend some time with me today, contributing to our former Jehovah's Witness series. Thank you, Gillie, for being here.
Welcome.
Gillie Jenkinson holds a PhD, is an accredited counselor and psychotherapist in the UK, and is experienced in delivering counseling face-to-face as well as on the telephone and Skype. She served 2 internships at Wellspring Retreat Center, Ohio, and has many years' experience working with trauma victims, including survivors of spiritual and cult abuse and sexual abuse. She has developed an approach to counseling former members, time away from post-cult counseling. Gillie was a member of an abusive Bible-based cult in the 1970s. She is a regular presenter at conferences and a published author, including co-authoring a chapter entitled Pathological Spirituality for a medical textbook entitled Spirituality and Psychiatry, published by RC Psych Publications in UK 2009. She is the mental health editor for ICSA Today. Gillie's doctoral research dissertation is entitled Freeing the Authentic Self, Phases of Recovery and Growth from an Abusive Cult Experience. We both hope that this talk will be of great value to former JWs and other helping professionals working with this specific group. I just wanted to clarify some terms before we get started into the interview. Because Gillie specializes in post-cult counseling and leaves it to her clients to define their group as a cult, if someone does not define their group as a cult, she is unlikely to work with them. For the purpose of clarification, during this interview, Jehovah's Witnesses may be referred to as cult. However, other terms may be used. Overall, I have 3 objectives for this interview and for this series broadly. Number 1 is to help former members identify psychological challenges that may arise when they leave the faith. Number 2 is to provide relevant background information for therapists working with former Jehovah's Witnesses. And number 3, provide information that will help former Jehovah's Witnesses in therapy better understand the issues in which they were dealing. I just want to preface this interview by stating that not everyone's experience leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses is the same. And we realize just how vast people's stories can fall on a spectrum. However, mental health difficulties since leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses is a common theme and a topic that individuals within our network indicated that they wanted more coverage on. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get to Gillie. Gillie, thank you again for joining me today.
Welcome.
Let's first start by defining the term cult.
Well, it's a big conversation defining the term cult, but when people come to me for Hope Valley post-cult counselling, they already define their group as a cult, as you already said. Mm-hmm. So I don't label it for them, they label it for me. But so they will have been in a group that requires them to believe and act in very particular and prescribed ways. Their activities, their likes, dislikes, etc., are likely to be dictated by the group and by the leadership. And their time, choices and pleasures are ruled over. So their future and education are regarded often as little value compared to the mission of the group or the aims of the group. In fact, their future is usually thought to be foreshortened because the end of the world is believed to be looming. Mm-hmm. And they often live under a threat and a shadow of death and doom that can occur at any time if they step out of line. They therefore often live in terror of stepping out of line or getting it wrong or expressing themselves differently to the group. In other words, individual needs and identity are lost in the work and the mission of the group. If someone leaves, they may well be rejected or shunned by the group, so they only have value as a member, and the cost of leaving can be very high indeed, and often or usually means losing all of family, friends, and often being cut off from all that they've known. In other words, the doctrine and the groove is more important than the individual on every level. So that's part of how I view a cult and what I've learned from others about what a cult might be. And there are actual succinct definitions as well, but that just gives a flavour.
And I appreciate you providing that, because there are so many different, approaches that people take to either labeling or defining or, this or that. So I appreciate you laying that out as a framework. So how can this term relate to the experiences of former Jehovah's Witnesses as they leave the faith and become part of the world?
Well, I mean, it's for them to look into the terminology, but I actually think it's vital to use the term. Now, this is quite controversial for some people, but not for me, because I think that actually what you need to do is diagnose the group, because without a diagnosis, you can't get a treatment. This is what one person who left a different group actually told me, that actually it's then an avenue to lots of other resources and information. So I think it's very important to find the right word that summarises whatever group you're leaving, and cult's a useful one.
And that in turn, I guess just understanding that term, it sounds like that in itself is useful for recovering.
It's often one of the first steps in recovering, because I've heard people say that, they left their group, they had no idea what they were dealing with, and then when they found that word, now with the internet, I mean, when I left there was no internet. In the old days, when so now you can type in a word or a name and so much stuff comes up. So it's actually really useful to use that word. And then, and we'll come to this, that person can chew over and decide for themselves, is this applicable or isn't it? It's not for anyone else to say, it's for them to work that out for themselves, in my opinion.
You have written pretty extensively on post-cult recovery and have explored the concept of the cult pseudo-identity and how it forms. Can you explain what the cult pseudo-identity is in further depth?
Yes, I can. Well, the cult pseudo-identity is the identity that we take on when we're members of a group, or the group, this type of high demand group. So those who are born and raised don't have any choice to take on an identity. They're born into it. And as they grow older, they have more choice. And those who don't identify with the pseudo-identity often leave with serious consequences. So I'll explain a bit more. And those who join take it on in order to be a member. So I joined a group back in the 70s, as you said, and really changed. I changed in every way, and I came to see, actually, I think that's the pseudo identity. It's a particular identity I took on in order to be a member. So I think the pseudo identity is layered onto the individual by certain psychological processes. So it happens through the things that happen to us. So for those born and raised, it's a fundamental part of their identity because they knew nothing else. And I suggest that it's kind of written through them. And we have a kind of candy here in the UK, which is called seaside rock. And you see a picture of it here. Brighton is a seaside town in the UK. And the word is written right the way through this candy, and it's a cylinder shape. And so one person who was born and raised described their identity like this. They said, it's like it's written through me, my whole experience. If you break the candy at any place, you'll see the writing in it. And so, you know, that the experience is written through them. And so actually identifying what is of them and what is of their group experience is quite a task for them and for a therapist working with them. And for those who joined, like myself, I see that I think I picture, I mean, playing with metaphors here, but picture the pseudo identity as being layered on like asphalt on a road, the authentic identity kind of sitting underneath like a seed ready to break through. You know, when you see asphalt that's old and it's cracking, and you see, incredibly, you see plants breaking through it. And, you know, I think sometimes that can be how it feels, having to break through something. And probably for both born and raised and those who joined, it probably has that similar feeling of trying to exert a sense of themselves. So, shall I carry on?
Yes.
Like, I'm thinking about, you know, to free the authentic, autonomous identity, we need to unlayer the cult pseudo-identity a step at a time. And this means the individual needs to understand the psychological dynamic. So this is really important. It's like a little word that's really, really important. So we need to understand sort of what happened to us in the group. How did this happen? How did this identity get formed and layered on, if we can say it was layered on, you know, which is another metaphor in a way of kind of looking at it. So, yeah.
And it, you know, you again, you mentioned it's kind of like the approach of, you know, first identifying, you know, what the group is to them, but in this case of the cult pseudo identity, it's, you know, my next question was going to be, why is it important for ex-members and mental health professionals to learn about this? Yeah. And from what I'm hearing, from what you are saying, is it's one of the first steps to recovery, possibly. Yeah. And I could be wrong, but it sounds like it's huge and just crucial as part of the recovery process, because there are a number of former Jehovah's Witnesses who may not have been born or raised, who may have joined later in life, and, you know, kind of learning maybe what led them to that journey, to that path, is, I think, a really crucial question.
Yeah. So that would be another phase, and later I'll come to how I view the phases. I think, but for all people who leave a high demand group or a cult or whatever, one of the first steps is to really identify it as whether it's a cult or not. And I'll explain a bit more in a bit. And then the second phase is to really understand the psychological dynamic. And but before that, I'd just like to talk about how does that happen? How do we take that in? And so, can I explain that to you?
Mm-hmm. Please do.
So, in order for the identity to be layered on, we have to take it in. And it's important to understand how we take it in. So, in terms of all the theory that I tend to use is Gestalt psychotherapy theory, which is, I did a master's in Gestalt, so I'm embedded in the theory. That's not to say there aren't many other theories, but I actually really find this one useful, and it's a little different to how other people think. And so when somebody's a member of a group with strict rules and requirements, they become dependent, don't they? You know, this is fairly well written about. And when we're dependent, we become confluent or merged with the group. So if you imagine two circles, and that's indicating two individuals, my hands are the circles, and they're separate. We make contact and we withdraw. You know, that's a healthy relationship.
Right.
We can move back and forth. But in a high demand situation, the circles are confluent. So you see here in the diagram on the PowerPoint that you've got the individual member who's required to be confluent with the group and the leader. And so that actually has a huge impact on the individual. And when we're confluent, something I call introjects flow in, and you see the black arrow.
Mm-hmm.
And so introjects are a really important part of the therapy I do, and people catch on to the idea and seem to find it very useful. So an introjects are those things that we swallow whole without chewing them over. So they become like food sitting in our stomach undigested but doing us no good. So they're neither being digested and nourishing us, but they can't be passed through the system either. You know what I mean? Talking about the digestive system. So we need to digest what we've taken in the group. We need to chew over everything that we're told. So those things that we're left with or that were most impactful are then critically appraised, and we're not just sitting with it there inside us. So one of the most important tasks in post-cult counselling is chewing over and critically appraising what we've been told. The beliefs, the doctrines, the negative beliefs about ourselves. So when I left my group, I actually believed that I was sinful, toxic, unworthy, that God hated me because I'd left. So that was very negative impact on my self-esteem and how I saw myself. So I really had to chew it over, and that's really the pseudo personality. But we also need to chew over the introjects we've taken in about various practices, such as whether we're going to celebrate birthdays, Christmas, whether we're allowed to have holidays. Because in many groups, having time off from the mission of the group is regarded as sinful or wrong. I know people from other groups, they could never have a holiday. Right. So it's really hard to allow themselves to look after themselves. So those introjects, those beliefs that aren't necessarily things we want to still believe. And another area that's rife with introjects is the language of the group, which can often control people because it's a sort of shorthand, a cliched language that bypasses critical thinking. So there are many words that people understand in the group that mean nothing to outsiders. I'm sure you're very familiar with that idea.
For sure.
And it's vital for former members and their therapists to think about these and to question them. So, I'll say a bit more in a minute. Let you have a word in.
Yeah, no, you're fine. And that whole concept is just, the way you put it is really fascinating and not a way that I've thought of it before.
Oh, really?
And so I really appreciate that perspective.
I mean, if I could just say one more thing about the pseudo-identity in terms of therapists.
Yes.
Because I think something I really want to speak to therapists as well as to former members, and that if therapists don't understand about this, and if we don't know about it, we may well end up counselling the pseudo-identity and not the authentic identity. And we may think we understand what the client's talking about, and we don't. And I've worked with people who talk in a stream of loaded language, and I always check out, especially if it's rather annoying. It can be a bit annoying, like, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? But actually, it's really important for me not to make the assumption that I understand what they're saying.
Right.
Even if I know about their group, actually, because I may know some of the language, but actually it might mean something different to them. So, and I just wanted to say that one of the ways that I deal with the introjects and the kind of things that people have taken in is to give people a simple chart with 3 columns on it. So there's the first column for the date. The second column is for a particular introject. So maybe having a holiday is sinful would be an introject. And then the third column is room for them to really challenge that introject and to actually say, okay, well, why do I agree? Do I disagree? You know, if it's a Bible-based group, does the Bible really support that that's actually a terrible thing to do?
Right.
And that way, actually, by doing that, we can start to chew it over and get it out of the system and own our life for ourselves.
Right. Right. And it also, you know, going back to just this concept of the pseudo cult identity as a whole. And I, you know, with someone who, like myself, who is a former member, you know, thinking about how I have like no frame of reference for what was before. And so in terms of recovery, it's almost a whole different ballgame than looking at what you're essentially proposing with this particular approach.
Yeah. So do you think it's useful for you?
Yes, I do. And it is. There are layers of it that are still extremely applicable, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of seeing it, I'm kind of trying to see it as that for those of you born and raised, and I can't say, only you can say, you guys, but, and only other people have to make up their own minds, whoever they are, but that actually it gets formed from within, but it's still layered over the authentic self. And so, and these things still stick in the system. And I think often there are lots of blind spots about them being there. And I think that's one of the core things of therapy, is to help someone to identify them and identify blind spots.
Right.
For themselves, you know, so as a facilitator and a sounding board.
Right. And so important for you to bring up as well, because, you know, part of my objective for this series is to, you know, how can I help prepare, you know, helping professionals in the field who maybe have a client who is a Jehovah's Witness for the first time. And I think that this is a really useful tool for them to present it. So, yeah. Thank you. Is there
Sorry, you did ask me another question.
No, it's okay. It's okay. My other question was, what are the differences between the self, this concept of self, and personality?
Okay. I mean, I'll try and keep this succinct. And what I want to say is there's many different theories about self and personality, very many. And people think long and deep about it. But I'm going to adopt a Gestalt psychotherapy view of identity. And in Gestalt psychotherapy, identity is made up of self and personality. So it's the whole identity, and then self, then personality. So the personality is the relatively, let me just, here you are. So this is probably a bit of a kind of overload of information, but if you can just stay with me and look at the blue bit at the bottom, that the personality is the relatively knowable, verbalizable aspect of the individual. And I imagine it as an octagon, rather extended octagon, with different parts or sides that present differently in different situations. For example, I'm a therapist, I'm a former member, I'm a mother, a wife, a trainer, a supervisor. So you can see here the different pieces. Is that clear? Like on the different angles?
Yes. Yes.
And then the self is the ever-changing active process of contacting the moment, the present. And this is the part of us that makes contact with others and with the environment, moment by moment. So, you know, we contact ourselves, we think, you know, what do I think about that? You know, what do you think about that?
Right.
And actually with our environment. So the two work together, with the self contacting and feeding into the personality. So is that clear?
Yes. Yes. So I guess if the environment in itself then, because, you know, like you mentioned, the self is what is continually coming into play with that. If the environment itself then is cultic,
Yeah.
what impact does that have on not only the self, but personality? Can it affect both? You know, is it a one or the other situation, or?
Well, I guess you know the answer to that. I'll give you a bit of theory or my thinking behind it. So I think that in a cultic environment, the personality becomes fixed. So it's not moving so fluidly between the different parts of trainer, gregarious, writer, blah, blah, blah. It becomes fixed. So it remains stuck and fixed as the pseudo identity takes over. So the cult identity takes precedence over all the other aspects. And I'll show you another slide in a minute, but I'll just talk you through it first. So I think that the self part up at the top actually becomes squashed. And one of my PhD participants said that she was squeezed, like those, you know, those squeezy balls for anxiety. She said it was like being really squeezed, really tightly. And so the contact with oneself, or with from the self to the personality, is actually ruled over by the group. So it's not, you know, and I know for second generation or those born and raised, they quite often, I know people have told me that they didn't have that luxury of really knowing themselves or what they thought. So I'm raising an idea that may be fairly alien to some people. But so the self becomes squashed. There's a sort of pseudo contact with the self and others, and because everything is done in the service of the group, it's not done in the service of the individual.
Of the individual, right.
So the authentic self is squashed by the group, also by the introjects, which are layering on, and by the self-suppression, which many ex-members say, you know, is part of it. It's like I have to push it down. And so the self-suppression is required of us as the environment closes in on us and affects who we can speak to, what we can read, our choices, what we wear, what we eat, who we have sex with. And so all of that is all that's personal to us gets really controlled. And as we buy into it, the pseudo identity continues to form and be maintained both by the group but also by us, because in order to stay a member, I had to suppress myself.
Right.
Anything, you know, we have to kind of suppress the doubts and suppress any desires. You know, you look at a boy and you think, oh, I quite like him. It's like, oh, suppress that. You know, so much can be being suppressed in that. So let me just, I'll show you the next slide. So it's a bit of a sensory overload. Sorry about that. So you can see at the bottom that the personality being squashed. You know, it's being squeezed. It's fixed. There's one presentation only. And then the self, there's no genuine contact, and we're not creatively adjusting or feeding the personality, and we're squeezed. We're not able to be fluid and in touch with ourselves. And the arrow on the top is the pressure from the cult and the leader causing the pseudo self to lay down, and pseudo identity to lay down over the identity, squishing the self, which no longer creatively adjusts but becomes fixed. Is that clear?
Yes. Yes.
So it's just this sense of everything being squashed down and getting fixed. That's the key.
Yep. You know, this reminds me of, there was a study that was done, and I'm sure you've heard of it and come across it, but I'll make sure and reference the study in the notes for this video, because I can't name the exact study or when off the top of my head, but it was done for the International Churches of Christ. And it was like a personality survey, and it sounds like you're aware of what I'm talking about. But correct me if I'm wrong, you know, when those who were surveyed were a part of the group, the personalities all just kind of, it was almost like this meld. And then, you know, post leaving, it had changed. And it kind of, you know, almost proves what you were saying with like this pseudo cult identity, you know, what is layered over what the real, you know, identity is. And so I'll make sure and reference that study. Because it was an incredible read at how the members of this congregation all just kind of melded. And I believe it was, of course, impacted due to the leader. And the leader was striving to be like Christ, apparently, in that congregation. So it's fascinating. I'll be sure and reference it.
Yes, great. A great thing to mention, actually. Yeah. He has a very unusual name, the writer. But it escapes me as well at the moment. But yes, it's very, very relevant in terms of this idea of just becoming one person. Because you think, you know, we're different in different settings, aren't we? I know I am. If I'm out for a hike, I'm different to if I'm giving a talk, or not totally. My personality is still there. It's still relatively stable and fixed. Of, you know, this is Gillie, but I'm different, you know.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that, because that just came to mind, and I was like, oh, how perfect. I'll have to cite it.
Yeah, perfect, yeah.
So, I guess the $1,000,000 question, right? What we were talking about. How does one eliminate the cult pseudo identity?
Yeah.
I realize that's a huge question, and there's probably a lot involved in that, and not an easy answer. But
I know what to say, because I think that's really the work that I do. Is really with those born and raised and those who join. You know, is what I'm working on with them to do. So I think one of the things is when the doubts get louder than the group, then we can begin to break free and we can start our recovery journey. And that journey is about undoing and getting rid of the cult pseudo identity. I think, you know, that's how I see it. So undoing the pseudo identity happens through understanding the dynamic. It really does. So that we start to as we understand that we've been unduly influenced, for example, as we start to understand undue influence, or Robert Cialdini's work on influence, then we start to be able to understand and think, actually, yes, that happened to me. I can identify that. So I can start to chew that over and think, actually, is that something I want to continue with in my life, or do I want to just to let that go? So we decide for ourselves. So in the Hope Valley Post-Cult Counselling, which is the model of counselling that I offer, we unlayer the pseudo-identity by looking at who the person. So I also have some worksheets where they're very simple. It's just 3 different pages. One is with a kind of a box in the middle and a figure that would represent that individual. And that, for those who joined, that would be the pre-cult self. That's not the case for those who are born and raised.
Right, yeah.
But I've worked with some who were raised, who have some history and some memory from before the group membership. And that's really important to get a hold of, I think. You know, if they entered at 5, they have some sense of what toys they loved, you know, what happened to them. Sometimes there's trauma involved and that needs dealing with later. But there is some sense of what their life was like before. So there's a little bit of experience there. And then I have a second sheet, again with just a picture in the middle. Someone can stick a photo on it. They can be as creative as they want. And that's life in the group. And then another one for life outside the group. It's very, very simple, but it's very effective
Yes.
in actually helping someone to think about who was I in the group, what was my pseudo identity, and what was there still of my authentic self that I'm taking with me into life afterwards. Is that clear?
Yes, and it honestly sounds really hopeful. Just with you explaining this, it brings me a sense of hope, at least. Just to kind of identify and isolate those things, like, okay, like this was my before, this is my now, or it could be, you know, my now once we work through some of this. And so, yes.
And when you're in the group, you know, one of my participants said there's still kernels, like seeds of things that I'm good at painting. I'm not actually, but you know, that the individual's good at painting and other people weren't good at it, or they were kind, or, you know, whatever makes you stand out from other people is really, really important. You know, it's such importance, even if it seems little. And so kind of, helping the person highlight and help them where they stood out in the group. And and for those who joined, you know, pulling on positive aspects of life before, hobbies, what did you love to do? I was a bit of a hippie. It's hard to believe, but I mean, I wasn't really fully a hippie. I think I liked to think I was, and I wasn't really that much. But, you know, it was, you know, I love wearing long clothes and being a bit flirty. And, you know, after being in my group for maybe 6 months, I was wearing things that I even now would identify as something an old granny would wear. I know I look like an old granny now, but, you know, I mean, really, the things that I just changed so much. Yes. And my mother said, "Oh my goodness, you stopped wearing makeup," which was makeup had been a big deal to me. So, you know, people are seeing this stuff on the outside. So,
well, and even something like clothes, the clothes you wear can be so major to yourself, but to, you know, other people, different people have different reactions. It's either a minor thing like, oh, it's just clothes, or it's a major thing like, oh, you stopped wearing that dress, right? And so it brings your world to like a standstill with that. But it is, I've noticed with clothing that's huge, and just how you can express yourself and how different that flows with time. So
exactly, clothes, your hairstyle, all these things seem maybe like not that important, but they're real control points within that sort of high demand situation.
Right.
So, and I mean, there's lots more I can say, because actually, if there's time, I'd like to just briefly talk about the phases of recovery.
Yes, absolutely. Please do.
Thank you. This is, again, another bit of a sensory overload, but I've already mentioned the phases, and this is how I approach recovery with former members, both populations. So phase one is actually we need to leave physically and psychologically, and you kind of often hear of people who are psychologically out but physically in, and people will know what I'm referring to, or, you know, physically out but not really psychologically out, still full of introject. So you can feel I've actually left the group, but you've still not really made sense of what's happening. And so this recovery process happens within phases 1 and 2 in the therapy and the work that I do. And this came out of my PhD. This is the core of what I learned really from doing it. And so phase 2 is the need to cognitively understand what happened to you in the group and how the pseudo-identity formed. So it's all around that. And this is a psychoeducational package. And I created a recovery workbook, which I think I showed you when you came to our house.
You did.
With ICSA in Manchester. And people go through that workbook with me, and it's a tool both to tell their story and focus on their experience. So, like, often you go to a therapist, how does it feel? Would you like to tell your story? Yes, you tell your story, and then you leave feeling horrible, and you've got nothing that's addressing or challenging the introject that you've been left with. So, the workbook and this work is about really giving something to that person to help them to make sense of what happened to them and to understand their experience. I don't tell them what happened. We talk about it and chew it over.
Mm-hmm.
And I've already mentioned about the building an authentic identity and those sheets. And I mentioned about the introject, but we talk about, you know, the right to set boundaries, finding your own voice, being allowed to say what you think. Trauma theory is really important to understand the very basics of trauma at this stage and what's happening in my body when if I'm feeling really anxious or really numb and depressed, I may be suffering from trauma reactions to everything that's happened. So it's important to really understand and identify that.
Right.
And then the heart of what I do is looking at thought reform or brainwashing theory. And that really is so liberating, looking at that and making sense of the experience in the light of that theory. And then unmasking the leadership. Are they human versus superhuman or godlike? You know, that kind of thing. Is that clear?
Yes. Yes. And very helpful to break it down into phases.
I think so, because I mean, the feedback's really good. You know, it doesn't do all of it. We have a life to live. We carry on, and things happen, and you know. But I think it's a kind of good phase to go through.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other phases are. Phase 3 is the emotional healing aspects of building a sense of identity post-cult, and that is really the sort of, in UK we'd call it the psychotherapy, the attachment stuff, and really healing the trauma, doing trauma work, sensory motor psychotherapy. You know, Van der Kolk is another writer who's written a lot about trauma. That would be where that lies. So I think, and rightly or wrongly, but I think it's right, that actually we need to understand what happened before we do the psychotherapy. And that's because I think otherwise we're addressing the cult identity and not the authentic identity. And then phase 4 is the freed identity, or a sense of actually I'm recovered. Nothing's perfect. I trigger off. Things trigger off for me sometimes, and I've learned to be totally at ease. Well, totally. It's not very comfortable.
Right, no.
I've learned to be at ease with that, to say, you know, okay, you're triggered. That's okay. I understand. It's just a memory. It's not happening now, and I can get on. And so that we can still be in phase 4 and know sometimes we have to revisit the phases. And, you know, and sometimes post-traumatic growth is referring to, actually, maybe I learned a lot of stuff from this. That's only for me to say. I would never say that to somebody else. It took me a very long time to come to a place of saying, well, I wouldn't have wanted it or wished it on myself, but I have learned from it. So that's that.
Wonderful.
That's the phases.
Wonderful. And these are, you also wrote an article out in the world, post-cult recovery.
Yeah.
These phases are mentioned in that article, right?
That's correct, actually.
Okay.
Yes, very briefly, but yes, I did look at them there, yes.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you, Gillie.
You're welcome.
Anything else you wanted to add before I get to my last question for former members? And it's aimed towards former members in recovery. Anything else where you're wanting to add before I?
No, thank you. I think that sort of sums up, you know, I thought very hard before we spoke about what would be useful, hopefully useful. So no, I think I've said what I need to say. Thank you.
Yeah. What's so incredible is it's useful, again, in my mind, to not only helping professionals, those who are involved in therapy, but also to former members to see the process. And that's, again, I'm assuming that's why you take the psychoeducational approach, because it's so valuable in teaching former members as you go. These can be the different processes.
Yeah. And it creates a sounding board,
Mm-hmm.
and that can then highlight the blind spots. So someone can be talking with me and they'll say, oh, well, that never affected me. And I'm like, maybe
Yeah.
not. And Rogerian therapy and a lot of therapies say, the client knows their own truth, and that is, that is true. But I actually don't think that former members have that kind of internal roadmap when they leave. I think they need help. I'm not saying they, we, I needed help to see actually what was happening, because Margaret Singer more or less said, and I'm trying to think of the exact quote, but if I paraphrase, that, you can't be subjected to thought reform and really know that it's happening. She probably put it slightly more elegantly than that. But actually, there's so much outside of our awareness, and so much that we think is us, that we're bad or evil or sinful, or we're not obedient, or we're rebellious, which is loaded language for many people.
Mm-hmm.
That we're not seeing it for what it is. And so we need someone to act as that sounding board, to at least to challenge it gently, not in any way scarily, but to just say, well, have you thought of this? Maybe it's actually not you, maybe it's something else.
Right. Thank you for sharing. My last question is, it actually has to do with the article that I just referenced. So you wrote this article, and it's called Out in the World, Post-Cult Recovery. There's a story about a woman named Jane that is mentioned in the article you wrote that I think highlights the difficulties that former members have or can often experience with therapy. And I'm going to go ahead and read just a snippet of that because I saw it as very valuable. Jane decided to find a therapist to help her with her culture shock and emotional overwhelm. She had no money. She had given it all to the cult over the years. And so she accessed a free local counseling service. She accepted that the trainee volunteer counselor would not know about cults, but hoped she would do some research and maybe and have just a little bit more of a clue next time. However, the counselor did not follow up the resources Jane suggested and insisted on exploring her family history, childhood experiences, and the reasons Jane joined the cult in the first place. This was not Jane's priority at this point. She said, my reality had already completely evaporated. So to start smashing all the foundations of my childhood resulted in me having a really bad triggery wobble. I was all over the place. I was having a bit of a breakdown. I was screaming in a ball on the floor. How I didn't smash the house up, I don't know. And just that story, I think, was really impactful to me because it illustrates the struggles of so many former members who seek, therapy and guidance, and, and just even getting into therapy is such a scary step in of itself. And so what advice, if you have advice, can you give former Jehovah's Witnesses who may have had similar experiences with therapy? How can one recover after a bad recovery experience? Essentially is what I'm asking.
It's a good question, and it's one many people tell me about. I think there's almost more research needs to be done on the experiences of people coming out and who go into therapy. And I've tried to have a voice, certainly here in the UK and a bit internationally, the internet these days, to actually say to therapists, you really need to learn about this. This is a very serious issue. And as you say, it's very hard for some people to go. It's hard for anybody to go into therapy. Never mind when you've been told that it's a wicked thing to do, you know. Or I know some groups really create phobias around going into counselling and therapy, and really dismiss it, you know, or that psychologists and psychiatrists are terrible, evil people, and they're going to do terrible things to you. And these phobias are also introject and have to be really challenged. So, you know, I had to think about this idea. I mean, obviously, I thought about it when I wrote the article as well. And, you know, I think probably it's knowing that you have the right to ask questions to anybody that you go to. So I suggest that if you want to go and see a therapist and you want to talk about your cult experience and you realize that's something you need to address, I think you probably need to ask the therapist in the first call and say, you know, is this something that you can deal with? Have you been on training about this? And if you haven't, are you prepared to learn about it? Because Jane had this terrible experience. I mean, it was terrible.
Yeah,
you know,
that's what it sounded like. It sounded awful. I know.
Absolute nightmare. You know, that's not what therapy's for. It's there to bring comfort. And I mean, that, you know, hopefully that doesn't happen too often. But, you know, so I suggest that when you contact a counsellor or a psychologist or a psychotherapist, that you feel at liberty to speak to them about it, to ask them, to shop around, to ask difficult questions. It's not rude, it's to be expected. And I actually, in Take Back Your Life, the book, I think, is a list of questions to ask therapists. And I've used that to send to clients or people who are looking for therapy, and I've created a sheet which I've added my own, and I'm happy to send it to you if you'd like to.
Yes, please do.
But it's really helpful questions to ask, because some therapists assume they know about cults because they read about cults in the newspaper or something. You know, you just think, well, that's not, you know. So there's not a lot of training around either. So, you know, I always encourage people to join ICSA because there's a huge database. There's a really solid research. There's such good people who are members of it who really understand. Buy the Cult Recovery book if you're a therapist. A number of therapists have bought that book thanks to me selling it here.
You got a bunch.
What?
I said you got a bunch.
I did. I got a bunch.
Yes.
You know, and there's one now gone into a training institute, which will be in their library. So that's really great. And I don't know if you know, I think I told you that I'm currently training 8 former cult members to work in this post-cult counselling model here in the UK.
I love it.
So we just did the first weekend, which was a recovery workshop, which was on the basis that actually there isn't a lot of therapy available for former members, that would be a place where these former member therapists could address their cult experience. And then we're going to look at the theory. They all bought the book and they're all looking at, you know, writing assignments and really investigating. So there's a bit happening for me. I'm doing my little bit. There's other courses here which are advertised on the ICSA website that people can have a look at if they're therapists. So, you know, there's stuff happening and therapists need to address it. I want to say as strongly as I can, if you're a therapist and you're watching this and you don't know much about cults, you really need to learn about it because there's so many people who need help.
Right. I hope these videos get shared all over the place. I've really enjoyed creating this little collection, and you certainly had so much to share that was so helpful. I'll be sure and add to your info for your private practice as well with the video.
I don't need any more work.
Yeah, I know you're busy for sure, but yeah, and I appreciate
to kind of pass it on really, and doing the training to pass it on.
Yes. And I so appreciate your hard work that you've put in, not only with this presentation, but in the field overall. And so I'm really appreciative. That was all the questions I had for you, Gillie. Was any last things to add, or you think we just
I just wanted to say, kind of to finish off on that last note, really, about seeking help. And I just wanted to say to ex-members that remember, you're not the problem. It's the lack of training with therapists that's the problem. And core training in the UK, certainly, and I'm sure in America, the little I know about it, it's not addressed. Cult issues are not addressed. Trauma is addressed, but you can still be addressing the pseudo personality with the trauma therapy. Right. You don't understand that. And you know, if there are people, there's a lot more ex-members coming forward who are training as therapists, and you know, some of them are working on Skype, and so that is another way of doing it. And I do a lot of work on Skype. So I just wanted to say, kind of don't give up on counselling, because it can be helpful, even if it doesn't address everything. And the other thing that ex-members may not know is that there are lots of different approaches to counselling. And so there's cognitive behavioural therapy, which is called CBT, and then there's other more talking therapies, less interactive. And some of these approaches are better than others, but people can go and investigate and have a look into it, see what you can find, chew it over for yourself. And you know, interview therapists, I already said that. And then, you know, I wanted to just to end on saying, you know, there is professional help out there, and there are self-help resources. So in my PhD, it was clear that we need to sometimes access professional help, but that self-help was massive and really, really important. That's what this is, I guess. So join ICSA, read the resources that are out there. There are new books coming out. Join safe forums. Find other ex-members. You know, find your tribe. And actually, ex-members are often a tribe for one another. They're like, you know, oh, well, we're talking the same language. And find what gives you pleasure and what you like to do. Keep safe. Don't join another cult. Don't cult hop. And remember that you matter and that your life matters.
And it's such a helpful note to end on.
And remember, there is a future. There is a future after.
Yeah.
Because people sometimes don't realise that your life matters. And that's so important to remember. And I'll finish on that point. Having got all emotional.
No, it's you made me emotional. But no, it's a wonderful, hopeful point to end on. Thank you, because in the midst of all of this, and recovery is a process with, you know, many wins and sometimes valleys, you know, it is important to remind ourselves of that. So thank you, Gillie, and thank you so much for the time you spending on this PowerPoint presentation. And yes, and stay tuned for more videos as a part of the series, and please share with everyone. So, all right, Gillie, thank you so much.
Okay.